So let's start off by getting Chordjam into our project. Now in Ableton here, I have a grand piano set up on its own channel. And I'm just hitting individual notes there, but we're going to turn those into chords in a second. Now I've also got another MIDI channel here, a blank MIDI channel, and this is what I'm going to drag and drop Chordjam onto. Now we have the interface all here, and I'll go through that in a second, but let's just make sure that that is routed into our piano so that whenever we hit any notes on Chordjam, it'll be routed through to the piano. So from the piano inputs, I'm going to select the Chordjam channel. This is the one that's just above there. And then from the second drop down, I'm going to select Chordjam. I'm also going to make sure that it's set to in as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to arm the Chordjam channel so I can hit any MIDI notes and they'll come through there. So you can now hear that by hitting those individual notes, we're now actually triggering chords. And that's how simple it is to get Chordjam set up within your project. Now let's open up the main interface and have a look through there. Now Chordjam features three main sections. We have the Chord Creation section at the top here, the sequencer section, and then also the pads. But we're going to go through each one of these in turn, starting off with the Chord Creation section. Now at the top left here, this is where we set the key that we're working in and the scale that we're working in. So from the drop down here, you can choose whichever scale you want to. For example, let's work in D. And then from the scale type, we can choose whichever scale we want. For example, we want major maybe. Chordjam also features a chord detection system as well. If you hit the magnifying glass and then drop your sample onto there, it will go through and it'll analyze that sample for the possible types of chords and scales in that sample. As you can see here, it's given us three different options, and we can choose whichever one is most appropriate for that sample. You can choose the different scales from the drop down, or you can use the left and right arrows to be able to choose between the different scales within there. You also have a random button here to select a random scale. Now that we've selected our key and our scale, we can now hit keys on the keyboard, and all the different chords that we play will automatically be in that key and scale. Next up, we can actually choose to put it up or down an octave. Next up is the chord type. This allows us to set what kind of chord type that Chordjam will then generate chords from. So let's, for example, choose minor ninth. Again, we can use the drop down to select that, or we can use the left and right arrows to switch between them. Or we can use the random button to select a random chord type. You'll also notice another button here next to the key, the scale, and the chord type. This is the trigger button, and we're going to come on to this in a later video, but believe me, it's a really interesting and very creative feature. Next up, let's have a look at the voices section. Now, Chordjam can generate up to 5 different voices from just hitting one key on your keyboard. We're using the minor ninth chord type, so that allows us to have up to 5 different voices. And within the voices section, we can really control this and do some very interesting stuff with it. For example, down the left-hand side here, we have the ability to enable or disable different voices within that chord. We can also shift the individual voices up and down an octave. We also have a random button, which allows us to really mix up the different parameters within the voices section. So you can keep clicking on that random button until you find the right parameters that you like. Now, linking quite closely to that random button is the infinity button. This is a really interesting feature because if you enable this, every single time you hit a key on the keyboard, this will all be randomized. So it's a bit like clicking the random button with every single key press. So I'm just pressing a single key on my keyboard there, and it's randomly changing those voices settings every time I hit that key. Obviously, if you like anything it does, then you can obviously turn it off and then it will keep those settings. If you want to revert the voices back to their default state, you can click this arrow at the bottom here. Now let's have a look at the velocity section. This allows us to control the velocity of every single one of those voices. You can see these little sliders here correspond to the 5 voices on the left-hand side here. So we can adjust these as we start playing the chords. Now we also have the random button within here as well. So whenever I click this, it will randomize all those velocities. Which can give you some really varied results, but we can actually fine tune this randomization because we have a minimum value and a maximum value, and we can set these to whatever we want to, and then those random results will actually be generated between these 2 different posts. So for example, let's increase the minimum and decrease the maximum. So it will randomize the velocities within these 2 dots. This can be really great if you want subtle variations in velocity. Now we also have the infinity button within this section as well. If I activate this, every time I hit a key, the velocities will automatically regenerate. So with every single key press, those velocities will be automatically randomized, which will lead to a more humanized kind of feel. And finally, on the right-hand side here, we have the time section. This allows us to delay the individual notes within our chords. So we can actually create a more of a strumming effect, for example, where we delay each individual note within that chord. This is more of a dramatic effect, but obviously you can reduce this and actually create more kind of humanized chords. And we also have our parameters at the top here, so we can add a upper and a lower amount that we want the time to be delayed by. And I can use the randomize button again. And of course, we have the infinity button in this section as well, which means that every time that we hit a note, those timings will be randomized. Now, at the moment, we're actually adjusting all of these delays manually, but we can actually enable sync, which will actually sync in time with our DAW. You can see when I adjust these, we can see the timings on the right-hand side here. Now, also within here, we have an ARP section. This allows us to take our chords that we're generating on the left-hand side here and turn it into an arpeggiator. We can change the direction at the top here, and we can change the rate here. And we can also give it a bit of swing as well. And finally, let's talk about the biggest button in this top section, the main random button. This will actually randomize all the parameters below. So every time you hit the random button, it will randomize the parameters in the voices section, velocity, and the timing. However, you can actually exclude any one of these sections from the main randomization. Next to each one of these sections, we have a lock button, a little key. This allows you to lock that and it won't be affected by the main random up the top here. So this can be useful if you've actually found the right voicing, for example, that you really like, but you want to randomize the velocity and the time both together. So as an example, we can take a fairly static chord like this. We can adjust the voices to make it sound a little bit more interesting. We can vary the velocity every time we hit the key. So I'm going to select the range. I'm going to put it on infinity. I'm also going to do the same with the time. I'm going to slightly vary the timing of those notes. Again, I'm going to put the infinity key on. Next up, we're going to have a look at trigger buttons within Chordjam. These are located next to the key, the scale type, the chord type, and also in the ARP section. And they function very similar to the infinity buttons, that whenever you enable them next to that control, it will automatically randomize that control with every single MIDI key press. Let's have a look at it on the key, for example. If I activate that within here, it will randomize the key within here with every single MIDI key press. That's definitely very random, but we do have more control over it. This is where it differs from the infinity control. If I go into the drop down here, we can see next to every one of these keys is the same icon for the trigger. Now these ones that are highlighted means that these are the ones it's going to choose from when trigger is activated. If I click on one of these, you'll see it kind of fades back. It's no longer highlighted, which means it's no longer going to be included when trigger is activated. If I click on it again, it will highlight again. Now, if I double click, it'll actually unhighlight all of them. It will deactivate all of them. And then I can choose whichever ones I want to. For example, I might choose D, I might choose E, and I might choose F. These are the three that are now going to be included with the trigger. Now I can do this with all the other controls, for example, with scale type. And again, if I go into the drop down, I can see all the different scale types here. I can deactivate them all and maybe just say I want the minor, the melodic minor, maybe I want the pentatonic minor, and then I can just close that down and it will go between those three. We could do the same with chord type. Again, you'll see the options next to each one of those. And we can also go into the ARP and do the same thing there. So by activating these trigger buttons, you can really make some creatively random progressions and melodies. So now we're going to move on to the sequencer within Chordjam. We can turn that on right here. So let's have a look at some of these new controls. Now the first control here is the amount of steps within the sequencer, and then also the time signature. And there's also a few other controls at the top here, but I'll come on to them in a little while once we start using those features. Let's have a look at the sequencer down the bottom here, because we actually have two different lanes. We have a robot lane and a human lane. So let's start off with a human one. This is where you can start entering your sequence in manually. So to add chords to the sequence, first of all, press the chord that you want on your MIDI keyboard. So that's the chord I want to put into the sequence. Now I just click, and that'll add a little dot within here. And what I can do is I can now stretch that out just by dragging it, and I can set how long I want it to be. If we press play, we'll hear it play its sequence. So let's add some more in there. Again, all I need to do on the keyboard is press the chord that I want. Again, I'll click, add a little dot, and then drag it back out again. It will always enter the last chord that you press on the keyboard. So that's all the settings up the top here. Let's hear how that sounds. Now, once these are on here, we can adjust them. So we can trim them, we can move them, and create whatever kind of pattern that you're looking for. Now, if you want to edit the voices, the velocity, or timing of any one of those chords, just select it and then use the controls at the top here. As well as adding chords, we can also add in arps. So any one of these notes here can be an arp. I'll click on this one and we'll switch over on the time tab to the arp. So you can really start to mix these up. We can also adjust the range of the sequencer as well with this purple bar going along the top here. So we can decrease it, for example. We can also use the arrows at the right and at the left here to nudge the notes. If you're not happy with one of the chords on there, you can just double click on it to delete it. Or if you want to delete the whole sequence, you can hit the little delete button on the right hand side. Remember, if you want to get anything back, there's the undo button at the top. Now let's have a look at the robot sequence. I'm going to delete this human one that we've already put in, and we're going to use this robot one here. Now this is again a randomly generated pattern for you. There's a few different parameters here that it's actually going to use. The first of these is the chord. You can see this little diagram here. It represents all the different keys on a keyboard, and each one of these keys is a different chord. The ones that are lit up in red are the ones that it's actually going to use when it comes to randomize. So it's not going to use every single chord within here, just the ones that are lit up. And you can simply toggle these by clicking on them. So I can choose whichever chords I want to just by highlighting them. If you want to audition any of these chords, just hit the key on your MIDI keyboard and you'll see it glow in purple here. And then you can press to activate it. So I've chosen 4 chords there and it's going to randomly pick between them when I go and generate the sequence. The second parameter that it will randomize the pattern with is the groove, and that's accessed by this little menu here. There are many different inbuilt grooves within here and you can create your own preset if you like. For example, let's pick one of the EDM grooves. We can see that it's already generated that pattern. So this is the pattern coming from the groove within here and the chords coming from within here. And you can continue to change those chords. And it will continue to update. Let's try a different groove. Let's go for maybe one of the pop ones. You can see as it plays the pattern within here, it will light up these keys in purple. We can also manipulate those chords as well using the top section here. So each time it actually plays one of those chords, it's using the settings at the top here. So let's try unlocking the voices and keep it on infinity to start regenerating different voices each time it plays through. This, of course, might be a bit too random for you. That's why we've got the lock icon here to lock anything that you might not want. So now we're going to look at progressions. Previously, we looked at the sequencer and using these little dots here to kind of choose which chords we want to use and making our own progressions. However, there are a whole load of progressions built into Chordjam right within this little menu here. We have all the factory preset progressions here, and you can load any one of these simply by just clicking on it. If I close the menu for a second and then regenerate this sequence, and in fact, I'm just going to change the groove for another one. So we've got a few more notes to have a look at. So we can now see these notes are being generated by this groove, and it's using these notes here, these chords here, and that progression. Let's remove this note at the end here and just drag that out. Now I can go into this menu and I can play around with some more of these factory preset progressions. You'll see on the left-hand side here, these selected keys keep getting updated. These relate to these little keys here and are all coming from the factory preset within here. But we can actually start playing around with these. We can actually move these to a different order. If I close out this menu for a second, we'll see that this has all been updated here. If you don't like one of these keys, you can double click on it to remove it. If you want to add your own key within there, simply select it on here. You can also duplicate any of these keys using the little icon at the bottom right-hand corner of the key. So at the moment we have it in progression mode, so the sequencer is playing these selected keys through in order. However, we can put it into random mode where it will select these randomly. Let me just close this and then select random, and we'll see this gets updated here. Now we can change this up by hitting the random button. Now, if there's any chord in there that you don't like, you can simply click on it once and it goes into edit mode, which means you can change any of the settings up the top, so the voices, the velocity, or the timing, or you can even hit another key on your Midi keyboard to change out that chord. And then when you're finished, just click on that chord again to exit edit mode. Okay, so let's take a deep dive into the groove presets menu. This is where we got a whole load of inbuilt presets for the different grooves for the sequencer. If I select one of these, for example, let's go for pop 1 and go out this menu again, you can see that it's automatically generated a groove in that template. And we can go through and choose different grooves within here. As soon as we click on them, it'll update in the background. You can see in here with each individual groove template, some of them have got more notes and some of them have got less notes. It obviously depends on the groove for that particular genre. Now, say for example, we pick one of these grooves and they work, but they don't quite work just as we want them to. We want to kind of edit them. That's what I'm going to do with this one. So we have our 3 notes within here, but I want to add some more notes within here. We can actually mix it up and do a combination between the robot sequence and the human sequence. So I'm going to take this note here. I'm going to make it a little bit shorter, give us a little bit more room to put a couple of our notes in. And I'm going to put a note in here and maybe a note in here. Now I can go ahead and edit each one of those. So for example, I can click on this note. I can hit a key on my keyboard and replace that chord within there. We can also nudge those notes around. I really think it works nicely starting here. So I'm going to just nudge those notes here. Let's try that. So now that we've got a groove that we really like, we can actually save this as our own template. I'm going to go back into this menu here, and we can see that we can save a new preset. I'm going to call this New Groove, and I'll click Save. And this has now saved it as a new template within the grooves within here. We can see over here is all our user templates. And if I want to delete any of the templates, you can hit the little delete button here. If I go back out this menu, and if I just delete these two here, what I can do is you can see we already have our new groove underneath here. I'll click the random button and you can see it's generated a brand new groove based on our groove within here. Now, if you've been through the preset menu and there's nothing really that you're liking within there, we can take it one step further. Let me just delete the ones that we got in here at the moment. I'm going to go back into that menu and we actually have a random option within here. If I select this, go back out the menu again, we can see here that it's randomly generating the chords and the sequence within here. And every time I hit the random button, it'll regenerate that groove. And it's different every single time. You'll also notice a new option has become available here. This allows us to specify how many notes are within that groove. At the moment it's set to 4, but we could increase this to 5, for example. We can also see another option in here, that infinity sign again. This will allow us to randomize this groove with every single pass of a bar. So if I activate this, you'll see this groove here get randomly generated every time it loops over. You'll also notice a number here as well. This is how many times it will loop over before it randomly generates that groove again. So for example, I could increase it to 2. So every time it loops over twice, it will randomly generate. This random feature can be really handy for generating those random grooves that you might not normally come up with. And of course, if you hear anything you like, you can just stop the playback in your DAW and then use this sequence that it's come up with. So we can see it's come up with this sequence here. And what I can do is I can actually drag this sequence into my DAW. There's a little button down the bottom right-hand corner of the screen here. If I click and drag from here, it'll actually drag the MIDI notes, the chords in that sequence, in that groove, into my DAW. Next up, we're going to have a look at the pad section of Chordjam. These are 16 assignable pads where you can assign chords or arps to each individual pad and then trigger them via a MIDI controller. Assigning a chord to a pad is dead simple. All you need to do is hit the key on your keyboard for the chord that you want to assign, and then press the pad. That is now assigned to that pad. And we can hit another key on the keyboard, and then hit the pad again, the second pad, and that's now assigned to the second pad. So we now have 4 pads set, and we can easily trigger them with the mouse or via MIDI controller. You can also assign an ARP to a pad as well in very much the same way. I'm going to go to the ARP section up here. I'm going to activate it. And then I'm going to hit a key on my MIDI keyboard just to play that ARP. And then I can just click on one of the pads and that will save it to that pad. Let's do it a few more times. And there we go. We got 4 different ARPs and 4 different chords assigned to our pads. I've put the chords on one side and the ARPs on the other, but you can put them in any which order that you want to. For example, there is also a latch option as well. Once that's enabled, it will play your chord quantized in time. The main use for the pads is triggering it via a MIDI controller, and you can assign this by going into the settings of Chordjam and into the MIDI CC mappings. If you scroll down, you'll see all of the different settings for the trigger pads. Now, if you've assigned a chord or an arp that you don't want on one of these pads, you can hit the clear button and then hit the pad that you want to clear. Once you finish clearing them, you can hit the clear again to toggle that off. If you want to get rid of all of the assignments, you can click on the clear all button. And if you want to save these pads and use them a bit later, you can click on the save button, which will open up the save dialog, and then you can put a name in for the pads. And click save. Now, next up, we're going to have a look at the preset manager within Chordjam. Now, when you add Chordjam to one of your projects within your DAW, obviously all of the settings will be saved to that project. However, using the preset manager allows you to save certain settings within here and load it in different projects. Now, this can be accessed by the little pencil icon here at the top right-hand corner of the screen, and this allows you to save various different elements of your Chordjam session. Now, this is broken up into 3 different columns. We have sessions, sequencer, and pads. The session allows you to save the whole session, so every single setting within Chordjam as it is currently. The second column is just saving the sequencer, so this is the current progression and pattern you have within there. And then finally, you have the ability to save pads. So if we close this down for a second, you can see here that I have some settings within the top part here. I've also got a sequence going on. And if we go into the pad section, you can also see I've got some pads already set up. And what I can do is I can go into the preset manager and I can save this whole session. And I'll click save. Now this is accessible every time that I open the Chordjam plugin. Whenever I put it in a new project, I can load this session and it will load everything that I had previously in it. The second option within the preset manager is being able to save the sequence. So this will actually save the progression and the pattern that you've got. So I can just save the sequence that I've got in here as my first sequence. I'll click save. And let's just do another example. I'm going to go out of here. I'm going to regenerate this sequence, come up with a new one. And then I'm going to save this one as well. I'm going to go to the edit tab again. And I'm going to do second sequence. So you can now see that I have 2 different sequences in there. And if I wanted to load the first one, for example, I could double click on it and it will then load it into the bottom section here. Now we've also got another little feature that's hidden away at the moment, our quick load bar. If I click on the presets button here, this will load our quick load bar. We can actually take a sequence and put it in here. So what I can do is I can go to the preset manager here, and you can see next to each one of these sequences, I can actually set the quick load position. So for example, this first sequence, I could put in the first quick load position, and I can put the second one in the second quick load position. If I exit out of here, you can now see that they're in 1 and 2. So if I click between those 2, it will load them up very quickly. This is really good for live performance. Now there's actually a quick shortcut to saving your sequences within here. Rather than going to the preset manager every time and saving it from here, you can actually just click on one of the plus buttons on the quick load bar to save that sequence straight into there. If I click that, that is now saved on number 3. And if I go into the preset manager, you can see that's now within there. If you want to remove it from the quick load bar, you can easily just click on here and select the dash. That will now remove it from there, but it will still be under here if you want to keep that sequence. If you don't want to keep that sequence, you can just hit the delete button here. Another really handy option within here is that you don't even need to load the sequence to actually get the MIDI from it. You can see we have a little MIDI icon here. I can click and drag this straight into my DAW and get the MIDI notes straight from there. And finally, I can save pads. There's 2 different ways of doing this. We've shown you before how you can save it directly from here by pressing the save button. You can also go into the preset manager directly and save the pads from there. That will then save the current pads that are loaded up. Now let's have a look at settings within Chordjam. They're accessed via the little cog icon at the top right-hand corner of the screen, and this is where you'll find all the different MIDI settings. The first one within here is the Midi CC channel. You can select whichever channel you want or set it to Omni. That is the default. Next up, it lists all of the external MIDI outputs, and for each one of those, you can select whichever channel you want to use on it. And then finally, we have the MIDI CC mappings. Every parameter within Chordjam that's available to be mapped is all within here. So you can choose whichever item you want to, say for example, one of the pads, and click on the assigning button to the right of it to select whichever CC control you want. And finally, we have keyboard mode. Keyboard mode allows you to select between absolute and relative pitch. By setting the keyboard mode to absolute, the keyboard will always play the actual notes. By selecting relative, the root note of the scale will always be played by pressing C and so on. For example, if you have selected the A minor scale within Chordjam and press the C key, in absolute mode, the keyboard will play C.